been over a page of trying to figure out how the minimum size of a sukkah, how we know it. How do we know that the minimum size of a sukkah is 10 tefachim? And so the Gemara is going through a whole series of learning it from this, from that. And even even the source of where we're learning it from, we had to figure out how big that is. Like we wanted to learn it from the Aron and the Kapiris, but we don't exactly how big the Kapiris is itself. So in order to figure out how big the sukkah is, we want to know how big the Aron and Kapiris. We have to figure out the Aron and Kapiris, and then we'll see if we can learn it from there. And then not necessarily could we learn it from there, because the Ark and the Kapiris really teaches us how big a domain is, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the sukkah, besides for the stach, would be 10 tvachim, would be 10 handbreadths. That would be a domain which would include the schach, maybe would be 10 handbreadths. So then the Gemara said, okay, fine. So we can't learn it from there. Let's learn it from the kruvim of the let's learn it from the wings of the cherubs. Because if we compare the cherubs of the Mishkan to the cherubs of the Beis Hamikdash, then we're going to be able to figure out how big they were. Again, with figuring out the source, how big that is, and then we can finally figure out what schach really means. In other words, how much of the empty space do you need to be a sukkah? How big? What's the minimum size for a sukkah? So we learned from. We wanted to learn if the Beis Hamikdash cherubs was a third of the height, so the same thing would be the cherubs in the Mishkan. Tabernacle would also be a third of the height, and if that's so, then it comes out that the ark itself, with the cover of the ark, was 10 handbreadths, and then there would be another 10 handbreadths for the cherubs. So that means the cherubs were 10 handbreadths, and that means the wings of the cherubs would be wings on top of an empty space of 10 handbreadths. And so then that's how the Gemara wanted to understand it. And of course, there were a number of questions that I'm just skipping out, but that's basically the second way of learning. In other words, the first way was from the ark. The second way is from the cherubs. And then the Gemara had a problem and said that everything sounds good, except for the fact that not everyone agrees with these measurements. Because Rabbi Yehuda seems to have a opinion that not every amma is equal. That some ammas, some cubits are 6 handbreadths, some cubits are 5 handbreadths. He says, and the ones for the cherubs and the ark are 5. These are really 5 handbreadth cubits. And if so, it messes up the whole calculation. You won't be able to prove that a sukkah is really 10 handbreadths. So after all that, we tried all these different things. What was the final conclusion of the Gemara is, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's Hilchasa Gemirila. It's going to be a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It's going to be a special law tradition from Moses. And this was on page 5b, where we finally came to this answer that, according to Reb Yehuda, this was about like maybe 6 lines up from the bottom or 7 lines up from the bottom on 5b, where it says Reb Yehuda held that it's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and that's how you know the law. Of course, that makes it much easier. We don't have any questions of how can you learn it from here? How do you learn it from there? And different questions that the Gemara dealt with. It's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It's like this is a tradition. It's just a fact. We got the law, mechitza. This is called a mechitza, a partition. The walls of the sukkah, like the term used here is the partitions of are 10 tvachim, 10 handbreadths, and that would be the minimum height of a sukkah. So that's what we've concluded. Now that doesn't mean that the other rabbi is not learning from the previous option. The other rabbi is learning from the other way. That was okay. He was able to learn from there. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Now, the question really is, if you think about it, now if you want to go back into the Gemara, into the previous Gemaras, and just rethink some things. So number one, the first Gemara wanted to say that the domain is 10 handbreadths because the Shechina rests above the board on top of the ark, right in between the cherubs. So where does the Shechina go? It always makes sure to be above 10 handbreadths because the ark with the cherubs is 10. And if Hashem's presence is above that, that means that Hashem doesn't go into a different domain, and the domain is the size of a domain is 10 handbreadths. Now, what's Reb Yehuda going to do with that understanding? In other words, how did Reb Yehuda understand that Gemara? Because Reb Yehuda would hold that how big was the ark with the cherubs? The ark with the, with the kaparis, with the board on top. How tall was that? That was the understanding is that it's a amma v'chetzi kaimasa, an amma and a half was its height. How big is that according to Reb Yehuda? According to Reb Meir, an amma is 6 handbreadths. So an amma and a half is 9 handbreadths. And according to Reb Meir, 9 handbreadths plus the board on top, 1, comes to 10 handbreadths. That means the Shechina does not rest below 10 handbreadths. That's the way the Gemara learned it. But the Gemara left out Reb Yehuda's view, and it only mentioned Reb Yehuda's view later because the Gemara got stuck with a different question. So it didn't deal with Reb Yehuda's view. It just dealt with Reb Meir's view, and it didn't even mix into that issue. It sort of totally disregarded it. But later, the Gemara mentions it for the next discussion, but it didn't mention it in that discussion. And seemingly the reason it didn't mention it is because it had a stronger question, had a bigger problem. And that had to do with the fact that the amount of a domain seems to include the roof as well. And that ruins our whole teaching from regarding the Sukkah, the laws of Sukkah. So the Gemara had a bigger problem. It didn't deal with Reb Yehuda. But let's think of Reb Yehuda's view. How big was the ark with the kapiris, according to Reb Yehuda, with the board on top? The ark would be an amma and a half. 5 handbreadths is an amma, according to Reb Yehuda. So how many handbreadths is an amma and a half? 7 and a half, right? Plus 1 tefach for the board on top would be 8 and a half. According to Reb Yehuda, what comes out from there? If Hashem doesn't rest below 10 handbreadths, not really true. Because Hashem rests at 8.5 handbreadths. So does Hashem rest below 10 handbreadths? Yes, Hashem rests right above the ark. So Reb Yossi's statement, and this is very important to know, and I'll tell you why. On page 5a, we had Reb Yossi, and he says, the Shechina never rests below 10 handbreadths. And what I've just proved to you, not my own insight, it's of course the commentaries deal with this, but the Shechina, what I've just proved to you is that this statement of Reb Yossi is contrary to Reb Yehuda. He argues, he's arguing with Reb Yehuda because Reb Yehuda would say that the Shechina does rest below 10 handbreadths because where was the Shechina? It was right above the kapiras, the board on top of the ark. And where was that? At 8.5 handbreadths tall. So does the Shechina rest below 10? Yes, it does. It rests at 8.5. So that means that Reb Yossi argues on Reb Yehuda. Reb Yossi obviously holds like Reb Meir. And this answers a big problem. How big is an amma? So we just said, well, there's an argument. Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda. Reb Meir says an amma is always 6 handbreadths. And Reb Yehuda says an amma sometimes is 5 handbreadths. Depends if it's an amma part of the building or if the amma is a vessel. A vessel is 5 handbreadths, right? Now, whenever you have an argument, Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda, who do we paskin like? Who do we follow? We generally follow Reb Yehuda. The problem is that the Rambam says that an amma is 6 handbreadths. He's not. How could he do that? How could he paskin like Reb Meir? How could he give the final verdict that we like Reb Meir's view if the law always accords with Reb Yehuda? So that's a big question on the Rambam, on Maimonides. he follows Reb Meir, even though normally Reb Meir, Reb Yehuda, you follow Reb Yehuda. And he says 6 handbreadths is an amma, is a cubit. So how does the Rambam hold that? The answer is, what happens when you have an argument between Reb Yossi and Reb Yehuda? Who do we follow when you have an argument Reb Yossi and Reb Yehuda? Reb Yossi we follow. We always follow Reb Yossi in an argument between Reb Yossi and Reb Yehuda. So what comes out is that the Rambam paskin like Reb Yossi. Reb Rambam is not following Reb Yehuda, and that's a Reb Meir, which is a problem. He's following Reb Yossi, who agrees with Reb Meir, and then it's not a problem that he's following Reb Meir. My mind is because he's really following Reb Yossi, because we just proved that Reb Yossi also holds. Reb Yossi also is of the opinion that a cubit is 6 handbreadths. And that is proven from 5a, the top of 5a, where he says the Shechina never rests below 10 handbreadths. And that only accords with Reb Meir's view, which is that the ark was at 9 handbreadths, and the cover of the ark was 1 more, and that's 10 handbreadths, and that's where the Shechina rested. And the Shechina never went below 10 handbreadths, and that would fit with Reb. That would be only Reb Meir's view. And so Reb Yossi holds like Reb Meir, and therefore the Rambam paskins like Reb Meir in this scenario, because he's really paskining like Reb Yossi. Okay, so that gives us a little insight into that. Another point that from the previous Gemara that should be mentioned is that the previous Gemara seemed to knock off the first interpretation. It seemed like we just disregarded it completely. And the reason we disregarded it was because, according to that way of learning, it would end up that a sukkah together with the schach, with the roof, all together could be 10 handbreadths. And that's not the halacha. The halacha really is the empty space has to be minimally 10 handbreadths, and it's not kosher if the schach is also counted in that 10 handbreadths. That would not be a kosher sukkah. The height, if the height is not an empty space of 10 handbreadths, that would not be a kosher sukkah. So the Gemara disregarded the source of learning that from the ark with the board on top of the ark. The only thing is, I just want to mention to you that the commentaries do say that it's not that the Gemara is disregarding that completely. We actually keep that lesson that teaches us a domain is 10 handbreadths. We still can learn, like Rabbi Yossi says, and we still use that for the laws of Shabbos. So even though the Gemara disregarded it, it was disregarding it regarding the laws of Sukkah. Because for a Sukkah, you can't dwell in a dira srucha, in a dwelling that's distasteful. And instead, you need to have empty space at least 10 handbreadths high. However, regarding the law of Shabbos, a domain needs to be 10 handbreadths high, and that is still learned from the fact that the ark was 10 handbreadths high. And because the ark was 10 handbreadths high, Hashem's Shechina doesn't rest below 10 handbreadths, at least according to Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Meir, according to those views, they learn this law of Shabbos from this teaching that the Gemara here brought. So even though our Gemara seemed like it was pushing it off and saying it's not, we can't use it, almost like it's erasing it, it's not true. It really is being used to learn the laws of Shabbos, that a domain is 10 handbreadths high. What would the case be? So the case would be, let's say an example, you have a type of sukkah, like a room that's 10 handbreadths high with the roof. With the roof, this room is 10 handbreadths high. So for sukkah, we're not going to be able to use it. But let's say Shabbos. Would that domain be called a private domain? Let's say you have this platform, right, that has some beam that has, of course, it has a certain measurement on the width and length, which I'm not getting into, but the height is 10 handbreadths high. If it's 10 handbreadths high, including the roof of it, So inside it, if it's a room that has an empty space inside of it, that's not considered a domain. But on top of it, that would be considered a separate domain because it reaches 10 handbreadths high. The floor of that second floor is 10 handbreadths high. And regarding the laws of Shabbos, that would be considered a private domain for the laws of Shabbos. And so that teaching that we have about a domain being 10 handbreadths is useful for laws of Shabbos as well. That's another point. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that the Gemara's second avenue of learning the measurement of a sukkah was from the cherubs that King Solomon made in the Beis Hamikdash. In the temple, the first temple, King Solomon made a second set of cherubs that were standing on the floor. And those, the Gemara said, were a third of the height of the Beis Hamikdash. It was a third of the height. And it says the Beis Hamikdash was Shishim Amma, was 60 Ammas, its length, and 20 Ammas its width, and 30 Ammas was its height. Remember, it's 3 times as tall as the tabernacle. The tabernacle was 10 Ammas tall. The Beis Hamikdash was 30 Ammas, 30 cubits tall. And the Gemara then says, and how big were the cherubs? And the Gemara, and the verse says that the cherubs were 10 Ammas tall. Now, those cherubs, according to Reb Yehuda, were those cherubs, were they really 6 handbreadth cherubs, or were they 5 handbreadth cherubs? Again, according to Reb Yehuda, that's a little confusing. He says that a amma cubit is 6 handbreadths if it's part of the building, and it's 5 handbreadths if it's a vessel. So when he made those cherubs, and the Gemara makes it automatic that, well, if these are the cherubs were 10 ammas tall and the ceiling was 30 ammas, so it's a third of the building. And then the Gemara says that the Mishkan was 10 ammas tall, which basically means 60 handbreadths. And that means that the ark and the kapeiros were 10. And that means that the other cherubs must have been reaching the same height proportionately as the cherubs in the Beis Hamikdash, so they must have been another 10. And the Gemara said, but this doesn't flow well because the ammas of Reb Yehuda are really 5 handbreadth ammas, and it comes out that it won't work, this calculation. He says, the Gemara said, the Aron and Kapeiros, according to Reb Yehuda, are only 8.5, and that would mean that the cherubs reached 11.5. That would mean that a sukkah has to be 11.5 handbreadths. Because 7.5, right? That's how big the cherubs themselves were from their feet to their head. Now, according to if we look back at the Beis Hamikdash, we have to now reevaluate. Maybe the whole calculation is off, according to Rabbi Yehuda, because what about the cherubs that were in the Beis Hamikdash? They also you have to calculate based on the fact that they're 5 handbreadths. And if they are 5 handbreadths, maybe the calculation would still work. That, in other words, that we don't have to go up to a third, because those cherubs in the Beis Hamikdash were 5 handbreadth cherubs, and so they were not a third of the height. and therefore maybe you could somehow calculate it properly. So the commentaries ask this question, and they say that no, it has to be that those cherubs were called part of the building because they were on the floor attached to the ground. Once it's attached to the ground, that makes it considered to be a 6 handbreadth cubit. So that's basically the Gemara's understanding that those were definitely 6 cubit, and that makes that the cherubs were a third of the height of the Beis Hamikdash, and then that's why we have a big problem that the cherubs in the tabernacle wouldn't have been the right height to prove the 10 handbreadths, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda learns Hilchasa Gemiri law. Okay, so that brings us up to where we're holding now, and we're up to this brisa, this
Rabbi,
this discussion in the Gemara about the measurements, and the Gemara is going to bring a Mishnah actually about different measurements and so on. Yes, David.
Yeah, I had a question about the verse where it's talking about King Solomon and the cherubs. So the verse says the height of the first cherub was 10 cubits, and likewise was the second cherub. Why would the verse say it like that? Why wouldn't it just say that both cherubs were 10? Why would it say the first was 10 and the second was, and likewise the second?
That's a good question. It's I mean, it's a stylistic type of wording, but I guess we could look it up in the commentaries on that verse in the Book of Kings and see if anyone emphasizes. I would tell you just it must be Kabbalistically each cherub symbolizes like a different element, and therefore it separates them. That would be my simple guess, but because it's symbolizing a different it's a very surprising concept. What are the cherubs in the first place? What exactly are they? But anyway, but it would be something to look up in that when you learn the Book of Kings, which we'd have to see what the commentaries say over there. Okay, so getting back to the Gemara, so I guess the easiest thing would be if we just start again from 5b, the bottom of 5b, and because we're in the middle really of this discussion, so let's just start there. 5b. Let's start at 6 lines up from the bottom of the page. Shiurin de Araisa Ninhu. Our measurements, are they biblical? And let me tell you, in the art scroll, is 5b3 on the second column. So the Gemara had just said that the measurements are halacha l'moshe Sinai, and the Gemara asks now that really, the Gemara says, really the measurements are a tradition. Shiurim de Araisa. The shiurim are not a tradition; they're biblical. They're in the Torah. And the chsiv, as it says, regarding the praising the fruits of Eretz Yisrael, it says Eretz Chitu Sa'ira. It's a land of wheat and barley, begefen, and grapes with teina, figs, verimain, and pomegranates. Eretz Yisrael and Vash. It's the land of olive oil and honey, date honey. And Rav Chanan says, pretty much says it straight out, that this verse is all telling us all about these measurements, that each of these items are a certain measurement in Torah and halacha. So that means that it's not really a halacha l'moshe Sinai, the measurements. And what's the cases? So the first, the Gemara brings a case of chita, wheat. What do we need to know the law of wheat? What's this measurement of wheat? It's lebeis hamanuga. It's regarding a house that has tzaras, and as we know that as we learned on Friday, that how a person enters that house, he becomes tameh, and if he's wearing clothing, then it depends how long he lingers in the house. He has to linger there for a certain amount of time, And so the Tnan, as we learned in a Mishnah, this is the Mishnah I think we were in the middle of, that it says, person enters the house that has taras in his clothing is on his shoulders. What does it mean on his shoulders? He's carrying. So when you carry clothing and not wear it, then you don't have to linger in the house, because when you enter, you become tamei. And when any item is entered, is brought into the house, it also becomes tamei. However, when you're wearing clothing, then there's a law of the clothing that you are wearing, that it has a rule that you have to linger there a certain amount of time in order for it to be considered tamei, for your clothing to also be tamei. It's like a more strict tuma. It's a more strict rule of impurity. Yes, Victor, did you want to ask something? So person enters this house that has tsaras, it has leprosy, and which is in Parshas Mitzayra. So the law is that so as our Gemara, as the Mishnah that we're bringing from the Goyim, from the tractate, which is a tractate about leprosy. So it mentions over there that if you're carrying your clothing on your shoulder, and you're also carrying your shoes, your sandals, your rings, you're carrying them in your hand, everything becomes tamei, impure immediately, even if you leave the house right away. Once you enter, it's too late. What about if you're wearing the clothing? And that's where now we turn the page to 6a. Hayalavush Kalov, the sandlov, baraglov, if you were wearing your clothing and your sandalov, your sandals are baraglov on your feet, on his feet, and his sandals are on his feet, and he enters the house. The taboisav, that's boisav, and his rings are on his fingers, and meaning he's wearing it. So who tamei miyad? So the person himself enters, so he becomes tamei immediately, even without lingering there at all. Walked in and out, he's tamei. And the hain, but the clothing that he's wearing, tahirin, they're actually pure. Ad sheyisha b'chdei achilas pras. Only if he waits there an amount of time that it would take to eat a half a loaf. A half a loaf is the amount of one meal. And the amount of this achilas pras, of eating this half a loaf, is a different. There's a measurement in time that we call kadei achilas pras, and there's a difference eating a half a loaf of wheat time wise, and eating a half a loaf of barley bread. Wheat bread and barley bread, one of them takes longer than the other, so we measure that. We measure from the wheat bread and not from the barley bread, which does take long. Barley bread takes longer, and therefore the pasuk is clarifying when it says eretz chitu sa'ira, that it's telling us a special law regarding the laws of Tumah. It's telling us that, and we learn it from the fruits of Eretz Yisrael, that it says specifically chita, that chita is meant to teach us this rule about Tumah, that it only applies that in order for the clothing of someone who's wearing clothing that come tamei, he has to linger the amount of time. That's achilas pras. Now, many of you are familiar probably with the laws of Yom Kippur, that hopefully it never, you don't know anyone that it was applicable to, but we all know about on Yom Kippur that if a person does need to eat, there's a certain measurement he's supposed to eat, less than a certain amount in the, only small, tiny amounts every, 9 minutes or 6 minutes. There's different opinions as to how, but that measurement of time is called achilas pras. That when we tell you that when we say that people are allowed to eat in certain increments, it has to do with the amount of time that a person normally eats their meal. And this law applies not only to Yom Kippur, it actually applies even in a regular meal. If you eat cake and you're a very, very slow eater, you might not need to recite an after bracha. I don't know people who are very slow eaters when it comes to cake. Most people gobble down cake. They can't control themselves. So therefore, there's normally not a problem to recite an after bracha. But if someone were to be a very slow eater and they eat one olive size, less than a achilas pras, they actually would not be able to recite an after bracha. In fact, that's why on tea, most people do not recite an after blessing, because tea is very hot, and people take little sips, tiny sips. You don't recite. If you don't drink it within a certain amount of time, you would not be required to make an after bracha, because it's not really drinking a significant amount, and it's just tasting. But if you would drink a significant amount, one shot, and you would recite an after bracha. So the same. This is the law of achilas pras that I'm sure. In fact, we do that with regard to Pesach. On Pesach, you have to eat the matzah within a certain amount of time. You didn't fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah unless you ate it together. If you are eating slowly and talking to someone while you're eating it, and you think you're fulfilling the mitzvah of matzah, you might not have gotten the mitzvah of eating matzah, because you did not eat a measurement of a kazayas within this achilas pras, within this specific amount of time. And again, there's big arguments between the rabbis how big this time is, how long it takes to eat this half a loaf of bread. Yes, Mordechai. Mordechai?
Yeah, yes. Is it that a person would eat wheat bread faster than barley bread, because since wheat bread is tastier than barley bread, he would eat it quicker, because when it comes to, barley bread is actually more porous than wheat bread. And if you look at halachas, like if you put a loaf of bread on top of an open wine barrel, it says that like the barley bread will absorb the fumes, but the wheat bread won't, because the barley bread is more porous.
So why would it take longer to eat the barley? Because it's porous.
I'm just saying that maybe it's because wheat bread is tastier, and so therefore the person's going to
eat it faster. I would think it has to do with the heaviness. Like a certain bread, certain breads are like really heavy. That's my guess, but I don't know. I'm not. The truth is, I don't know if I've ever seen any barley bread. Is that commonly made? Maybe health food stores. I don't know. I know spelt bread is very popular, and cornbread I've seen in bakeries, but I don't know, barley bread. I don't know how popular it is. Maybe time of the Gemara, I guess it was popular. Okay, anyway, in any event, so that's the law of Tuma. And so paschitim loy pasoirim. And it's also masiv v'eichel b'lifton. And it's not just eating the bread, but it's eating it while a person is masiv, heseba, which also is connected to Pesach, but eating it while they are leaning, reclining, and eating it with lifton, with some type of a dip. And then the Gemara says, and what is the lesson from sa'ira, from barley? Did not, because we learned in a Mishnah, and this had to do with the impurity of a bone of a corpse. That it says etzem, a bone, kisa'ira, that's the size of a barley kernel. Metame b'maga, it's metame with touching, uvamasa, and with carrying. Beina metame ba'oyo, but it does not cause tuma. That's that bone of a corpse that's so small, it does not cause tuma in an oil. It will cause tuma if someone touches it. It will cause tuma if someone carries it, even if they don't touch it, because they're carrying its weight. But it will not cause tuma if it's in an oil, and there's certain measurements that need to be fulfilled in order for the tuma to be able to spread during for an oil, for a tent. And that has to do with the majority of the body, majority of the spine. There has to be certain rules of for the tuma for a tent. Now, and if it's under the same tent as other items, then it's that size, it's a reach, it's the majority of the limbs of the person or the build of the person, or full complete head of the person. So that would cause tuma in an oil, but not the size of a barley kernel. Barley kernel would only be matame b'maga uvamasa, and so we need to know the measurement of a sa'ira of a barley kernel for this law of a corpse. And even though nowadays it doesn't apply as much, but in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, people needed to be careful about